The morning air hung heavy over Fort Whitmore, a sprawling military installation just outside Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Captain Sarah Chen stood at attention in the motor pool, watching the mechanics work on the A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft assigned to her squadron. She had been waiting 3 years for this moment, 3 long years of being passed over, talked down to, and quietly dismissed by nearly everyone who wore the uniform. Sarah was 28 years old, with dark hair pulled tight into a regulation bun and eyes that held a quiet determination most people failed to notice. She came from a military family. Her father had been a colonel in the Air Force, and her mother had served as a nurse in the Army. Sarah had wanted this life since she was 7 years old, playing with toy fighter jets in her bedroom while her younger brother built blocks on the floor. But the military, the real military, not the one she had dreamed about, was different from what she'd imagined. The moment Sarah completed her pilot training, the problems started. During her first year at Fort Whitmore, her commanding officer, Major Robert Hendricks, made his opinion of female pilots crystal clear. He never said anything directly in front of witnesses, but his implications were always there, hanging in the air like smoke. "You're certainly qualified on paper," he'd said during one flight review, emphasizing the last 2 words in a way that made the meaning unmistakable. When Sarah landed the aircraft perfectly after a 6-hour training mission, he'd remarked to another officer, loud enough for her to hear, "Well, she didn't crash it. Small victories." The other pilots noticed. They always noticed when the commanding officer treated someone differently. Some of them, the good ones, tried to make Sarah feel welcome. But others followed Hendricks' lead, making jokes about her size, her strength, her ability to handle the pressure. They called the A-10 the girl's plane when they thought she couldn't hear, as if the most heavily armored aircraft in the Air Force was somehow less dangerous or impressive in her hands. Sarah's mother had warned her about this during one of their weekly phone calls. They sat in Sarah's small off-base apartment, drinking coffee on a Sunday morning before Sarah had to return to the base. "They're afraid of you," her mother had said simply. "Always have been, always will be. You're better at this than most of them, and they know it. That scares men like Hendricks." "I just want to do my job," Sarah had replied, staring into her cup. "I want to fly, I want to serve, I don't need them to like me." "No," her mother agreed, "but you need them to respect you. And respect, sweetheart, is something you have to take in this world. Nobody gives it to you." Now, 3 years later, Sarah was about to prove her mother right. The mission had come down the chain of command 3 weeks ago. A team of American advisors had come under heavy fire in a small village in northern Syria. The enemy had entrenched themselves in civilian buildings, using the local population as cover. Ground troops were pinned down, casualties were mounting, and the situation was deteriorating fast. Air support was needed, precision air support that wouldn't cause unnecessary collateral damage. That's where Sarah came in. Major Hendricks had announced the flight assignments at a briefing room in front of the entire squadron. When he got to Sarah's name, he'd paused just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. "Captain Chen will provide close air support," he'd said, then added, "along with Captain Morrison." Morrison was the squadron's most experienced pilot. He had 11 years of service and over 200 combat missions. Pairing him with Sarah on a sensitive operation like this was standard procedure when a pilot was on a critical mission. It also, in Hendricks' mind, guaranteed that Sarah wouldn't screw it up. Or at least, if something went wrong, it could be blamed on the rookie. Sarah had felt the eyes of every pilot in that room on her. She kept her expression neutral, her shoulders back, her jaw tight. She'd learned long ago that showing emotion was just ammunition for people like Hendricks to use against you. "Yes, sir," she'd responded, nothing more, nothing less. For the next 3 weeks, Sarah had trained constantly. She studied maps of the area. She reviewed satellite imagery. She practiced her approach vectors, her weapon deployment sequences, her abort procedures. She ran scenarios over and over in her mind, visualizing every possible outcome. Captain James Morrison had noticed her preparation, and he'd given her a slight nod during one of their planning sessions. Morrison was one of the good ones. He treated Sarah like a fellow pilot, not like a mascot or a problem to be managed. "You're going to be fine," he'd told her. "Just stick to the plan, trust your instruments, and remember, you've done harder things than this in training. The only difference is that this one matters." The morning of the mission arrived on a Tuesday. Sarah woke at 400 hours and went through her pre-flight routine. She'd eaten a light breakfast, gone through 3 cups of coffee, and checked her equipment 3 times. She drove to the airfield in the dark, watching the sun beginning to rise over the mountains that surrounded Fort Whitmore. Morrison was already in the briefing room when she arrived. They went through the final details with the ground controller, a captain named Derek Williams, who would be coordinating all air assets in the region. Williams was sharp, professional, and had a good reputation. Sarah felt slightly better knowing he'd be the one guiding them in. "Weather looks good," Williams had said. "Visibility excellent. Ground situation is still hot but manageable. The friendlies are dug in and waiting for you too." Sarah had nodded, mentally running through her checklist one more time. The cockpit of the A-10 was Sarah's church. In that seat, with the canopy closed and the engines roaring to life beneath her, she felt whole in a way nothing else made her feel. The aircraft responded to her touch like it understood her, like it trusted her. She ran through her pre-flight checks with practiced precision, speaking into her radio in the calm, measured tone that all pilots cultivated. Morrison was in the lead aircraft. Sarah followed him through the takeoff sequence, feeling the weight of the Thunderbolt settle as they accelerated down the runway. The nose lifted, the wheels left the ground, and suddenly they were flying. The flight to Syria took 6 hours. Sarah spent most of it in a state of focused calm, monitoring her instruments, adjusting her heading, checking her fuel consumption. She'd been through this dozens of times in training, but never before had the outcomes been so final, so irreversible. As they approached the combat zone, Williams' voice came through her headset, calm and steady. "Whiskey 9 and Whiskey 10, this is ground control. We have enemy positions marked for you. Stand by for coordinates." Sarah acknowledged the call. Her heart rate increased, but her hands remained steady on the controls. This was what she had trained for. This was what she was meant to do. Morrison descended first, making his approach run. Sarah heard him communicate with Williams, heard him call out his targets, heard him request permission to engage. "You are cleared hot," Williams said. "Danger close to friendlies, good pass." Sarah watched Morrison's position on her tactical display. She saw him line up his approach, and then she heard something that froze her blood. "Whiskey 9 is taking fire," Morrison reported, his voice still calm. "Multiple impacts. Hydraulics are not responding. I'm losing control." "Eject, eject, eject," Williams commanded. There was a moment of silence. Then Sarah heard the sound of an ejection pod launching, the parachute deployed. Morrison was out. But then there was no more communication. Sarah descended through the sky toward the combat zone, her mind racing. Morrison was down, possibly injured, possibly captured, and she was still in the air, still armed, still dangerous to the enemy. "Whiskey 10, Williams said, his voice urgent. "Continue your run. Morrison is on the ground and secured by friendlies. Maintain course." Sarah's training took over. She focused on her target, on her approach, on her mission. There would be time to worry about Morrison after the job was done. She made her first pass, unleashing a burst from the GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted in her nose. The sound was unmistakable, a deep, rapid-fire roar that was more like the growl of an angry god than any human weapon. The ground shook beneath her as the rounds struck their targets. She made another pass, then another. Each time she selected her targets carefully, staying close to her friendlies, ensuring that her fire was devastatingly accurate. After 45 minutes, the enemy resistance had collapsed. The friendlies reported that they had secured the area. Williams confirmed that Morrison had been recovered and was being treated for burns and a broken arm. "Good work, Whiskey 10, Williams said. "You're cleared to return to base." Sarah banked her aircraft back toward Fort Whitmore, her hands finally beginning to shake as the adrenaline started to fade. She'd done it. She'd flown her first combat mission. She'd made a difference. She'd helped save lives. She had no idea that in just a few hours, her triumph would turn to ashes. When she landed, the airfield was strangely quiet. Usually there was a debrief process, maintenance crews waiting to service the aircraft, commanding officers ready to review the mission. But today, there was almost no one. Sarah climbed out of the cockpit, her flight suit damp with sweat, her mind still partially in the sky. She walked across the tarmac toward the hangar, looking for someone to tell her what to do next. That's when she saw Major Hendricks standing with Colonel Elizabeth Morton, the base commander. They were talking quietly, and when Hendricks saw Sarah approach, his face changed. It became hard, cold, official. "Captain Chen," he called out, "report to my office now." Sarah's stomach tightened, but she kept her face blank. "Yes, sir." In Hendrick's office 10 minutes later, Sarah stood at ease while the major sat behind his desk, his jaw clenched. "I've just received a report from ground control," he said slowly. "It appears there was an incident during your close air support run." Sarah remained silent. She waited, knowing that whatever was coming, she needed to let him finish before she responded. "One of your targeting runs," Hendricks continued, "resulted in friendly casualties. 3 soldiers were killed, 7 more were injured." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Sir, I checked my firing solutions with ground control 3 times. All targets were confirmed as hostile positions." "Your judgment was flawed, Captain," Hendricks said coldly. "You made a mistake, and because of that mistake, American soldiers are dead. That's something you're going to have to live with." "Sir, with respect," Sarah began, "I need to review the mission data. There may be." "What you need to do," Hendricks interrupted, standing up, "is prepare yourself for a full investigation. In the meantime, you are grounded. No flying, no duties with the squadron. You'll report to admin and wait for further orders." Sarah left his office in a daze. 3 soldiers dead. American soldiers, because of her. At least that's what Hendricks had said. But something didn't sit right. She had been so careful, she had triple-checked everything. Over the next 72 hours, the story got worse. The official report came down that Sarah's aircraft had been the source of the friendly fire incident. The evidence seemed conclusive. The pattern of the wounds matched the rounds fired from the GAU-8. The timing of her run corresponded with the moment the casualties occurred. Sarah was confined to base pending a court-martial hearing. She had lost her security clearance, lost her pilot status, and lost the trust of nearly everyone who knew her. The local newspaper picked up the story. "Female pilot in friendly fire scandal," the headline screamed. Her mother called her that night, her voice tight with worry. "We'll get through this," she said. "We'll find a lawyer and we'll fight it." "Mom," Sarah said quietly, "I'm marked as KIA to everyone here. Even if I'm not dead, I'm done. My career is over." She wasn't being dramatic. That's how the military worked. One incident, especially one involving dead soldiers, could end everything you'd built. And if that incident happened to occur when you were already fighting against people who didn't believe in you, well, there wasn't much chance of recovery. Sarah packed her personal items into a cardboard box and waited in her small apartment for the formal charges to be filed. She watched the news on television. She read the articles online. Everyone had an opinion about her, and almost all of them were terrible. She was a cautionary tale about why women shouldn't be in combat roles. She was proof that minorities lacked the judgment required for critical military decisions. She was a symbol of what happened when the military prioritized diversity over competence. No one, she noticed, was waiting for the full investigation results. No one was considering that there might be another explanation, because Sarah Chen had already been sentenced in the court of public opinion. And in that court, she had already been marked as something worse than dead. She had been marked as a failure, as a burden, as someone who didn't belong. The only person who seemed to believe in her innocence was Captain James Morrison, calling her from the hospital where he was recovering from his injuries. "Something's wrong with their story," he'd told her. "I know these things, Sarah. I've flown enough missions to understand the ballistics, the timing. Something doesn't add up, don't give up." But Sarah was tired of fighting. She was tired of proving herself over and over to people who would never believe in her no matter what she did. She was tired of being the woman who had to be twice as good to be considered half as valuable. She had survived the impossible. She had become a pilot in an air force that didn't want her. She had flown her first combat mission and completed her objectives. And now she was destroyed by it. Or at least that's what everyone thought. Sarah had been confined to base for 8 days when she received an unexpected visitor. She'd been living in a kind of limbo, technically still a member of the Air Force, but stripped of all meaningful duties or responsibilities. She reported to a small administrative office each morning, signed in, and then was essentially told to disappear until her court-martial hearing, which was scheduled for 3 weeks out. She'd taken to spending her days in the library on base, reading military history books and trying not to think about the current disaster of her life. That's where the civilian investigator found her. His name was Thomas Blake, and he was employed by a private firm that occasionally contracted with the Department of Defense to review complex military incidents. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with gray hair and the kind of calm confidence that came from 40 years in law enforcement and military investigation. "Captain Chen," he'd asked, standing at the entrance to the library's small reading room, "I wonder if I could speak with you for a few minutes." Sarah had looked up from her book, a biography of Amelia Earhart, which felt depressingly appropriate, and studied him carefully. "I'm not supposed to discuss the incident with anyone except my assigned military counsel," she'd said, keeping her voice neutral. "I'm not here to ask you about the incident," Blake had replied. "I'm here to ask you about what happened before it." That had caught her attention. Sarah had gestured to the chair across from her, and Blake had sat down. For the next hour, he had asked her detailed questions, not about the friendly fire incident itself, but about the mission planning process, about how the targets had been selected, about how the firing solutions had been confirmed, about who had access to the mission data before she deployed. "Why does this matter?" Sarah had finally asked. "They already have the evidence, they have the ballistics reports." "Because," Blake had said carefully, "some things in this case don't add up, and I've been hired by someone to make sure everything adds up before this goes to a court-martial." "Who hired you?" Sarah had asked. Blake had smiled slightly. "That's something I can't discuss, but I can tell you that this person has significant pull, and they believe you're not telling the complete story of what happened. Or rather, they believe that the complete story hasn't been investigated properly." Sarah had wanted to believe him, but she'd also learned that hope was a dangerous thing when you were in her position. Hope made you vulnerable. Hope made you believe that things might work out, and when they didn't, it hurt worse than it would have if you'd never hoped at all. Still, over the next 2 weeks, Blake had visited her several times. Each time he'd asked more questions, and each time she'd started to notice something troubling about the official narrative. "Walk me through the targeting process one more time," he'd said during one visit. "Specifically, walk me through how ground control confirmed that your last 3 targets were hostile." Sarah had closed her eyes, pulling up the memory. It was recent enough that it was still sharp in her mind. The radio conversations, the coordinates, the confirmations. "Ground control told me the coordinates of the target," Sarah had recited. "I verified those coordinates against my tactical map and my forward-looking infrared display. I confirmed that there were no friendlies within 500 meters of the target. I received verbal confirmation from ground control that the target was confirmed hostile. Then I made my run." "And ground control definitely confirmed those targets as hostile?" Blake had asked. "Yes, 3 times I asked, and 3 times Williams confirmed." Blake had nodded thoughtfully. "And who was ground control? Do you remember his name?" "Captain Derek Williams," Sarah had said. "He was sharp, professional, he knew what he was doing." Blake had said. "That's interesting." "What's interesting?" Sarah had asked. "Well, I've been doing some digging into the investigation file that was turned over to your military council, and I've noticed something odd. The official report lists the targets that you engaged as having been selected by you unilaterally. It says that you chose these targets without requesting confirmation from ground control." Sarah's head had come up sharply. "That's not true. I never do that. It's against protocol, and it's stupid. You always confirm before you engage." "I know," Blake had said, "which is why it's interesting that the report says otherwise." That conversation had been the beginning of the unraveling. Blake had started doing more than just asking questions. He'd started pulling records. He'd gotten copies of the radio communications from that day. He'd reviewed the mission logs from all of the aircraft and ground personnel involved. And slowly, a different picture had started to emerge. 2 days before Sarah's court-martial hearing was scheduled to begin, Blake had come to her apartment with a file folder thick enough to hold a novel. They'd sat at her kitchen table, and he'd laid out what he'd found. "The radio communications tell a very different story than the official report," he'd said, opening the folder. "Look at these timestamps. Ground control explicitly confirmed each of your targets before you engaged. That's documented. There's an audio recording." "Then why does the report say I didn't confirm?" Sarah had asked. "Because someone altered the report," Blake had said simply. "Someone with access to the systems changed the narrative to make it look like you acted outside of protocol." "But why? Why would anyone do that?" Blake had pulled out another document. "That's where it gets complicated. I've been looking into Captain Williams' background, and I found something very interesting. He's been assigned to Fort Whitmore for 18 months. During that time, there have been exactly 4 incidents where aircraft have been involved in situations where commanders wanted a particular outcome. What kind of outcome? Sarah had asked, though her stomach was already starting to turn. The kind where a specific pilot gets blamed, Blake had said. Look at this. 2 years ago, there was a training exercise. A pilot named Richardson was supposed to fail. He didn't. He flew perfectly. But the official records were altered to show multiple failures. Richardson was reassigned before he could catch the discrepancy. Blake had laid out another document. A year ago, a pilot named Hernandez got into a dispute with her commanding officer. A month later, there was a friendly fire incident blamed on her. She's no longer with the Air Force. You're saying this is a pattern, Sarah had said slowly. You're saying that they've done this before. I'm saying that someone, or possibly a group of someones, has been manipulating incident reports, Blake had said. And I think I know why. I think I know who's behind it too, but I need to prove it. He'd pulled out one more document. The authorization for the missiles strike against the buildings where your targets were located came from Major Robert Hendricks. He authorized the attack. He selected those buildings as hostile positions. But if your report shows that you acted without confirmation, then the blame falls on you instead of on him. Sarah's mind had reeled. He set me up. Hendricks set me up deliberately. I believe so, Blake had said. And I think I know why. I pulled some personal finance records completely legally through proper channels, and I found some very interesting transactions. Hendricks has been making deposits to an offshore account. Large deposits, and they seem to correspond with times when military assets were used in ways that benefited certain private contractors. Wait, Sarah had said. Are you saying he's corrupt? He's actually corrupt. I'm saying, Blake had replied, that there are a lot of questions that need answers. And I'm saying that your court-martial hearing is scheduled to start in 2 days, and we need to make sure the right questions get asked. The night before her hearing, Sarah couldn't sleep. She'd lain in her bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what Blake had told her. Major Hendricks, the man who had overseen her career at Fort Whitmore, who had made it clear he didn't believe in her, had deliberately set her up to take the fall for friendly fire casualties that weren't actually her fault. The betrayal of it was almost worse than the accusation. But there was something else, too, something beneath the betrayal, something that had been growing in Sarah ever since the moment she'd landed her aircraft after that first combat mission. It was anger, real pure burning anger. She'd spent her entire military career being underestimated, mocked, and doubted. She'd fought for every single achievement, every single promotion, every single moment of respect. And just when she'd proven that she belonged, just when she'd completed her first combat mission successfully, someone had taken that away from her out of spite and greed. The court-martial hearing began at 900 hours on a Thursday morning. Sarah sat at a table with her military counsel, a JAG officer named Lieutenant Colonel David Park, who had been quietly preparing a defense based on the evidence Blake had given him. The prosecution laid out their case. They presented the altered report. They presented the ballistics analysis. They presented a narrative in which Sarah Chen, either through inexperience or negligence, had engaged targets without proper confirmation from ground control, resulting in friendly fire casualties. The courtroom was quiet. The 3 officers serving as the jury, they were called a panel in military courts, took notes. Sarah's court-assigned defense counsel sat beside her, occasionally patting her arm in what he probably thought was a reassuring gesture. It mostly just reminded her how alone she was. Then it was their turn to present their case. Lieutenant Colonel Park called 3 witnesses. First, Captain James Morrison, who testified that Sarah was the most careful, thorough pilot he'd ever flown with, and that he'd been shocked by the allegation of friendly fire caused by careless targeting. Second, he called an audio technician who testified that the original audio recording of ground control communications had been altered. The technician, an expert with 20 years of experience, demonstrated using the actual files that deletions and insertions had been made to the recording to make it appear that Sarah had acted without confirmation. Finally, he called Thomas Blake, who presented his findings about the pattern of similar incidents, the altered reports, and the financial transactions. The prosecutor, a major named Catherine Hughes, fought hard against Blake's testimony, arguing that it was irrelevant speculation. But Blake had prepared well. He'd documented everything carefully. And by the end of his testimony, even the prosecutor seemed to be reconsidering something. The hearing was recessed, and the panel withdrew to deliberate. Sarah waited in a small room off the courtroom, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. Park tried to make reassuring conversation, but neither of them could focus on anything except the simple fact that her entire future hung in the balance. An hour later, they were called back. "The panel has completed its deliberations," the chief judge announced. "We find that the evidence presented by the defense raises significant questions about the integrity of the original investigation. We recommend that this court-martial be postponed pending a full reinvestigation into the incident, with particular focus on the alleged alteration of audio recordings and the patterns suggested by investigator Blake." It wasn't a verdict of not guilty, it wasn't even a dismissal of charges, but it was a stay of execution. It was time to prove her innocence. And it was a crack in the door that had been slammed in her face. Part 3, the second investigation. The Pentagon does not move quickly. This is a well-known fact among those who have dealt with military bureaucracy. But the recommendation from Sarah's court-martial panel carried weight, and the higher-ups had enough good sense to realize that an investigation into corruption and evidence tampering was something that needed to be handled with care. Within a week of the hearing's postponement, a full investigation had been launched. It was headed by a brigadier general named Margaret Foster, who had a reputation for cutting through nonsense and getting to the truth. General Foster was a woman in her late 50s who had risen through the ranks the hard way, and she had zero tolerance for the kind of games that had been played with Sarah's case. For the next 3 weeks, Sarah watched as investigators interviewed everyone involved in her mission. They re-examined the audio recordings in detail. They pulled financial records, communication logs, and command chain decisions. They interviewed everyone from Captain Williams to Major Hendricks to Colonel Morton. Sarah wasn't allowed to participate directly in the investigation. It was being handled at a level above her clearance, but Lieutenant Colonel Park kept her updated on what he could tell her. "It's not looking good for Hendricks," Park had told her during one update. "They've found discrepancies in how he handled several other incidents, and there's something else. They've discovered that Hendricks has been working with a contractor company that specializes in military logistics. Apparently, he's been steering contracts to this company in exchange for payments to an offshore account. It's bigger than just your case, Sarah." The news was both vindication and disturbing. It meant that Sarah hadn't been imagining the unfairness of her situation. It also meant that the system she dedicated her life to serving had been compromised by the very people who were supposed to uphold it. 3 weeks into the second investigation, General Foster called Sarah to her office at the Pentagon. It was Sarah's first time there, and the massive complex of buildings and corridors was almost overwhelming. But she pushed that aside and focused on the meeting ahead. General Foster was sitting behind a polished desk when Sarah entered and saluted. The general looked up from her papers and,